It was supposed to be a routine confirmation hearing. Instead, it became the moment constitutional oversight died in the U.S. Senate. What you are about to see is Attorney General nominee Pam Bondi completely losing control, attacking senators instead of answering basic questions about military raids, corruption investigations, and taxpayer money. And then Schiff delivered a response that will shake you to your core. This isn't just about bad behavior. This is about the systematic destruction of congressional oversight and the normalization of contempt for democracy itself. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this single hearing represents an existential threat to American institutions. The breakdown started when Democrats asked three simple legitimate oversight questions. Questions any responsible senator should ask. Questions that go to the heart of how our government operates and whether it follows the law. Question 1. What was the legal basis for military-style raids where troops repelled from Black Hawk helicopters to assault apartment buildings in major cities, zip-tying children in the process? This isn't some partisan gotcha question. When the federal government uses military tactics against civilians, Congress has not just the right but the obligation to understand the legal framework. Parents watching this happen in their neighborhoods deserve to know why their children are being restrained with zip ties during government operations. Question 2. In a closed FBI investigation, reportedly $50,000 was paid to a White House border czar before he became the White House border czar, with the expectation that he would be helpful in arranging contracts once in position. What happened to that money again? This is basic oversight. When taxpayer funds potentially flow to government officials in exchange for future favors, that is the definition of corruption that Congress must investigate. Question 3. What was the legal basis for blowing up ships in the Caribbean? Reports indicate the Justice Department wrote an opinion justifying the destruction of vessels in international waters. Senators have every right to understand when, how, and why the DOJ authorizes military action. These weren't attack questions. They weren't designed to embarrass or trap anyone. They were fundamental oversight inquiries that any attorney general should be prepared to answer with facts, legal citations, and transparency. Instead, what happened next revealed something deeply disturbing about how Pam Bondi views her role and her relationship to congressional authority. Rather than providing legal justification for military raids, rather than accounting for $50,000 in taxpayer funds, rather than explaining the constitutional basis for destroying ships, Bondi did something unprecedented. She launched personal attacks against the senators asking the questions. Not policy disagreements, not legal arguments, personal attacks. And here is the part that should terrify every American regardless of party affiliation. These attacks were pre-written, prepared in advance. Canned responses designed not to inform Congress, but to insult and intimidate its members. Think about what that means. Bondi and her team sat in preparation sessions, identified which senators might ask tough questions, and crafted personal insults to deploy instead of legal answers. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a heated exchange that got out of hand. This was a calculated strategy to replace accountability with aggression. When Senator Whitehouse asked about the FBI investigation and the $50,000, Bondi didn't explain the legal framework or provide documentation. She attacked Whitehouse personally, questioning his character and motives rather than addressing his legitimate oversight function. When the ranking member asked about the legal basis for military-style raids involving children, Bondi didn't cite legal authorities or explain procedural safeguards. She insulted the ranking member, suggesting his questions were somehow inappropriate when they represented the most basic responsibility of congressional oversight. This pattern repeated with every serious question. Rather than demonstrating legal knowledge, constitutional understanding, or respect for separation of powers, Bondi consistently chose personal warfare over professional responsibility. And then something remarkable happened. Schiff, the junior-most member of the committee, stood up not just for his colleagues but for the principle of congressional oversight itself. Schiff's response wasn't just defending Democrats from Republican attacks. It was defending democracy from authoritarian contempt. Listen to his words carefully, because they represent one of the most important constitutional moments in recent Senate history. If members of this committee can't ask those serious questions and get serious answers, we can't do oversight, Schiff declared. I am new to this committee. I spent about a decade on the House Judiciary Committee. I never saw a hearing like this with a cabinet officers. Schiff wasn't exaggerating for effect. He was stating a constitutional fact. Congressional oversight exists because the founders understood that power without accountability becomes tyranny. When cabinet officials can insult Congress instead of answering to it, the entire system of checks and balances collapses. But Schiff went further. He made clear that this wasn't about partisan loyalty or political gamesmanship. If I did and some Democratic cabinet officer were to personally attack each of my Republican colleagues, I would call for a stop to it. It would be disgraceful. That is what real constitutional leadership looks like. Defending the institution over the individual, protecting the process over the party, maintaining standards regardless of who benefits politically. Schiff then delivered the line that cuts to the heart of this crisis. If this becomes the template for future hearings, we won't be able to do any oversight, and things will just degenerate. This is the warning every American needs to hear. Bondi's behavior wasn't an isolated incident or a bad day. It is a template. A new normal where executive officials feel entitled to attack legislators instead of accounting to them. When oversight dies, democracy doesn't fade gradually. It collapses suddenly because there is no remaining check on executive power. Courts can rule, but they depend on executive enforcement. Congress can investigate, but only if officials answer questions honestly rather than deflecting with personal attacks. Schiff's most powerful moment came when he directly addressed the human impact of these policies. I would expect that if troops were rappelling from helicopters in any city in any of your states and hog-tying children, you would want to know the legal basis, and so would I. This isn't abstract constitutional theory. This is about children being tied during government raids. This is about taxpayer money potentially being used for corruption. This is about military action being taken without clear legal authority. These are the real-world consequences when oversight fails and accountability disappears. But here is what makes this even more troubling. After Schiff's passionate defense of congressional oversight, after his clear explanation of why these questions matter and why personal attacks are unacceptable, the committee chairman's response revealed the depth of institutional decay. Chairman Grassley essentially shrugged. His defense amounted to, well, Democrats were loud during a previous hearing with the FBI director, so what did you expect? This is moral bankruptcy disguised as both sides' equivalence. Grassley equated senators asking tough questions with a cabinet nominee launching personal attacks instead of providing legal answers. He normalized behavior that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. When the chair of a Senate committee treats insults as equivalent to oversight, when he suggests that maintaining basic decorum is somehow too much to ask, it signals that institutional standards have completely collapsed. Grassley admitted he just let the show go on the way the senators wanted to go on. But this wasn't about senatorial preference. This was about a cabinet nominee refusing to fulfill the most basic requirement of confirmation hearings, answering questions about how they'll execute the law. The breakdown of this hearing represents something much larger than Pam Bondi's temperament, or even Donald Trump's approach to governance. It represents the systematic delegitimization of every institution that questions executive power. From the courts to the press to Congress, the message has been consistent. If you demand accountability, you are the enemy. What we witnessed was that mentality spilling into the Senate chamber, traditionally the most deliberate and respectful space in American government. Bondi's strategy revealed the Trump administration's fundamental approach to oversight: attack the questioner, ignore the question, and treat accountability as aggression. This isn't governing, it is warfare against democratic institutions. The specific questions Bondi refused to answer tell their own story about what this administration wants to hide: military raids in American cities using tactics that would be controversial in war zones, financial arrangements that look suspiciously like corruption, military actions taken without clear constitutional authority. These aren't partisan issues. They're fundamental questions about how power is exercised in a constitutional democracy. When an attorney general nominee can't or won't explain the legal basis for government action, it signals that the rule of law itself is under attack. Schiff's intervention wasn't just defending his colleague's dignity. It was defending the idea that truth still matters, that hearings should be about facts rather than theater, that government officials have obligations to the people they serve rather than just the person who appointed them. The tragedy is that this breakdown was entirely preventable. Bondi could have answered the questions. She could have provided legal justifications, constitutional frameworks, and factual information. Instead, she chose personal warfare, revealing either contempt for congressional authority or an inability to defend her actions on the merits. What makes this particularly dangerous is how it normalizes dysfunction. When insults replace answers, when personal attacks substitute for legal analysis, when respect for institutions gives way to political combat, democracy doesn't just weaken, it breaks. The international implications are staggering. America's ability to promote rule of law globally depends on maintaining credible institutions at home. When our own Attorney General attacks Congress instead of answering to it, it provides cover for authoritarians worldwide who want to justify their own contempt for legislative oversight. But perhaps most disturbing is how this represents the complete abandonment of the idea that government officials serve the public rather than their political patrons. Bondi's performance wasn't about protecting national security or legal precedent. It was about protecting Donald Trump from accountability, even at the cost of democratic norms. Schiff's warning deserves to be heard by every American. These questions deserve answers. I would expect that if troops were rappelling from helicopters in any city in any of your states and tying children, you would want to know the legal basis, and so would I. This is what is at stake, not just political positioning or partisan advantage, but the basic right of citizens to know how their government operates and whether it follows the law. When that right disappears, when officials can attack questioners instead of answering questions, democracy becomes impossible. The choice before us is clear. We can accept this new normal where accountability is treated as aggression and oversight is replaced with personal combat. Or we can demand better. We can insist that government officials answer to the people they serve rather than just the person who appointed them. This hearing wasn't just about Pam Bondi's confirmation. It was about whether American institutions still function or whether they've been captured completely by authoritarian contempt for democratic accountability. Schiff showed us what resistance looks like: principled, constitutional, focused on institutions rather than individuals. His defense of congressional oversight wasn't partisan, it was patriotic. The question now is whether enough Americans will recognize what is being lost and demand its restoration before it is too late. Because once oversight dies, once accountability disappears, once officials can insult citizens instead of serving them, democracy doesn't come back easily. This is the moment. This is the choice. This is why it matters that people see this, understand it, and stay engaged. Because democracy doesn't defend itself. People do.